All right. Hi, I'm Colleen. I'm here again with the Integrated HPS grant, and I'm really excited to be talking to Dr. Alan Love today. He's the John M. Dolan Professor of Philosophy at the Minnesota Center for Philosophy of Science at the University of Minnesota, and I'm really looking forward to speaking with him today. So we can get started. If that's good with you. Yeah, so I guess the first question I would like to ask is just a more general one about like your writing and research style. So kind of what's your writing process and how do you decide which topics to write on, like the topic you submitted for the proceedings?
Yeah, I think that it's a really good question to think about whether or not always we are conscious of our way we make those decisions. I think sometimes we are just following our nose and we're interested in a topic, and I think that's a healthy thing to have. And so making sure that we're reading things that maybe fall outside of maybe what we would typically read so that we're being stimulated to maybe identify new things. But I'm kind of constantly doing that, and some of those things then blossom into projects where they are going to sort of involve a lot. And the project that had been going for a little bit of time that motivated my submission to Integrated HPS was a project that's a collaboration with the National Human Genome Research Institute at the NIH. And there, Chris Donahue is the historian working there at the NIH. And he had approached me and we began talking about the possibility of bringing together historians, philosophers, sociologists, as well as the staff scientists who had been working on various genomics projects and kind of doing a 30-year retrospective related to the Human Genome Project, which began in 1990. So that's kind of the big project, and then my own contribution that was submitted has to do with a part of the genomics initiative out of the NHGRI called ENCODE, and thinking about functional genomics. How do you identify functional elements in the genome? And we zoomed in on even a smaller subpart of that, the model organism ENCODE, which looked not at the human genome, but more at fruit fly and C. elegans genomes and compared them. And there we made a basic argument that people who had worried that the determination of function was being made prematurely by using the wrong concept of function actually misconstrued the methodology, and that in fact the determination of function is always by indirect proxies, and that when you looked closely at the historical development of the project, you see that it's changing in real time in response to new things that were available technologically, and then also new data that became available. And we think we discovered some kind of interesting results that come out of that, which don't have to do with do we have the right function concept, but rather how do we reason using proxies about function in genomics. So that was our particular contribution, and we think there's some broader lessons there about the importance of proxies in scientific reasoning, and I've been working on those in some other contexts as well.
Oh, that's really interesting. I have a couple kind of follow-up questions to that, but if you wouldn't mind, could I ask you for like a specific question about the project?
Yeah, sure.
So one of the theses in your presentation that you submitted to the proceedings is that, functional genomics gives us this dynamic toolkit that you just talked about of proxies, and this gives us new forms of data and theoretical tensions. I was really interested in the theoretical tension part of that. If you wouldn't mind maybe briefly explaining one of the tensions that arises or how they arise.
Yeah, it's a key result of the paper, I think, that we tease this out. So here's in a nutshell the one of the issues. Strategies for determining function sometimes rely on evolutionary reasoning. In the genome, that would be often something like, if a sequence is conserved through time across different species, it's because it's functionally important, and therefore by comparing the sequence as that's conserved, we can get a handle on evolutionarily stable sequence. Now, what's fascinating about that is conservation is homology, right? What we're making a claim about is that this has been conserved from a common ancestor. Yet when we started tracking these proxy strategies in mod and code, as they developed, they were actually blending these evolutionary considerations of conservation with considerations of biochemical activity. And they were making claims like a particular percentage of the transcriptional activation states are conserved. And so we're no longer talking about a sequence, an element, or a structure, but something like a relationship that would be the thing that's homologous. And the issue there is simply that those relationships appear to be more from the domain of analogy or convergence. That is, we think of organisms that are swimming and they have the same demands in the water to be relatively streamlined, and therefore we would expect that they would converge on principles such as a streamlined body in order to more efficiently do that. Now, we don't think that's homologous because we think that's going to be true of any organism that has to swim, so that a shark is got a similar body shape to a dolphin, even though they're not closely related. But in a sense, what was happening in the genome was they were making a claim like the shark and the dolphin have the same relationship, but then they were calling it homologous. And so then the question is, well, why are we calling that homologous? It doesn't seem like it may be appropriate. Now, we didn't resolve the tension in the paper. One of the things that we were clear about is that we think this is a kind of emerging tension. It's not, oh, there's a problem and you have to fix it. It's more, you discovered something and you have to make sense of it. But it was something that became much clearer once we were looking at these specific methods that they were using in functional genomics, and sort of realized that the researchers found their way into a space they hadn't originally thought they were going to land in, and therefore had to start thinking, what do we make of this? How do we interpret it? And therefore, the theoretical tension was kind of what we articulated in the paper to try and make that as clear as possible.
Yeah, that's really interesting. I could see how even just like identifying and kind of talking about the presence of that tension kind of helps like puzzle pieces snap into place a little bit when thinking of these like big projects. Like I know when I think about like projects like the Human Genome Project or anything, it's like kind of very difficult to kind of imagine how all the different research like fits into each other. That's awesome. That's really interesting.
Yeah.
If you wouldn't mind, I'm going to kind of ask just a question about your work just on the project broadly. So it's really cool to me, or interesting, I guess is a better word to use, that you're able to do this sort of like really interdisciplinary work with like all different sorts of people, like sociologists, anthropologists, and scientists. Have you done a lot of work like that in your career, or is this kind of like a new?
No, that's actually pretty normal. It's been my kind of standard working mode for many years. I think it probably was natural in part because I came out of the sciences into history and philosophy of science. So I kind of always had an orientation towards practice. I also while I was doing my PhD, did a master's degree in biology at the same time. So in the midst of writing my PhD, so I also had this kind of strong connection with the practice of science while I was doing my historical and philosophical work. The collaborations have emerged very organically over time. None of them are sort of so clearly, oh, I would have imagined you would work with that person. They more have to do with opportunity and the way in which things kind of cascade. As you spend time interacting, you meet at a workshop, you say, hey, I'm going to organize a workshop, and so you invite somebody who you met at another workshop, and there's this snowball effect where after a while you realize, hey, we're talking about a paper, and let's write it. And so then you do. And then you can have situations where somebody who's a collaborator of the other person gets pulled in, and you may not have been talking to them at all. Or in the case of the sciences relationships, say with lab members, say postdocs who are working in the lab at the time, I mean, the sciences generally are much more collaborative than the humanities. And so that culture of collaboration is very normal for the scientists and was something that I was quite comfortable with and have felt like I could work quite effectively at that juncture of the different disciplines. I do think that it is a potential challenge for any of us working in integrated HPS, because we have to be careful about sort of maintaining appropriate interpretive distance, because sometimes we are making claims that the people who are involved are going to disagree with or have strong feelings about. And I have certainly been in collaborations where things got tense.
Yeah, I could definitely see that happening. Oh man, that's really awesome that you get to do a lot of interdisciplinary work like that. And if you wouldn't mind me asking too, how did you kind of get interested in philosophy of science and history of philosophy of science coming from a science background? That's really kind of a cool pathway to this type of research.
So I very much backed into it almost accidentally. So I was studying molecular biology and genetics, and really wanted to minor in something else as an undergraduate. Actually had pursued a music minor for a little bit of time before giving that up, and decided on a whim, and by on a whim, I mean in my own mind, when I go back to that time, I can think of no good reason why I did it. Decided to sign up for a minor in philosophy at the beginning of my junior year. So I've gone through 2 full years of undergrad, not taken any philosophy, and thought, this looks interesting, maybe I'll try it. And so my classes were very standard. It was an introductory logic class and an introduction to philosophy. And I think I failed my first paper in the introduction to philosophy class. It was on Spinoza's ethics, so maybe I don't need to be blamed for that. But
so that's a difficult first paper. Oh my gosh, I don't think mine was on that. I'm pretty sure my first philosophy paper was like defining the categorical imperative or something. Not that.
Oh, that could be its own challenge too. But anyway, so I was just very interested, and I think that what happened was I had come to an increasing realization that I didn't want to continue in laboratory science. Yeah. However, I found the intellectual environment very stimulating, and that began to be philosophy where that was happening more than it was the sciences. And it wasn't until I was finishing up as a senior that I really bumped into philosophy of science, because the courses that I had were not philosophy of science courses. They were very standard political philosophy and early modern and things like that, which I found interesting. But then all of a sudden, somebody's pointing me in the direction of philosophy of biology, and I thought, hey, that might be exactly what I am interested in. And from there, it really did pick up momentum, and led to my going back to the graduate program at the University of Pittsburgh in history and philosophy of science.
Oh, wow. Yeah, that's awesome. That's a really awesome path towards it. Um, Funny, it's kind of similar to me. I won't take up too much time with this, but yeah, I was a chemistry major and like did like lab science and like really impulsively decided to do philosophy. And my first class was philosophy of science, and like now I'm here, so it works. It worked out.
It happens. One can fall in.
Yeah, I think I always found it cool because I think like I realized like philosophy of science kind of like does what I like growing up kind of thought science did. Like the data, I just never really got the day-to-day lab as much as philosophy of science. That's really cool. Yeah, that's awesome. Oh, sorry, just funny. So I guess, yeah, if you want to transition back a little bit to talking about your work, I just want to be cognizant of time too. I don't want to take up too much of your time, so I won't hold you too much longer or anything. But I was wondering if you would just want to talk about anything like you're currently working on at the moment that you're like really, really excited about, which the project that you're most excited about.
Yeah, that I think is difficult, because part of my current problem, and maybe this is related to how COVID has impacted all of us, is that certain projects that I thought would be finished are not, and therefore I have probably more irons in the fire than I would have originally thought a year and a half ago would be true at the end of 2020. I'm very excited about finishing a book project that is on evolution and development, that kind of pulls together some ideas that I've been working on for a number of years in looking at conceptual issues in evolutionary and developmental biology. And so hopefully I can get that knocked out here very soon. I'm very close. And I've also been working with some biologists and other philosophers on a project focused on the topic of evolvability. And so this began in 2019 and involved some time in residence in Oslo, Norway. And we're currently working on papers related to the concept of evolvability as a disposition and as a potential unifying concept in evolutionary biology. And so we've got a couple collaborative papers currently at work on that. Additionally, I have a collaboration with a biologist, Gunther Wagner at Yale, that is on stress in development and evolution. And for that, that's actually a grant project that we had start in 2019. I now have a postdoc, Amanda Corus, who just came from the University of Cincinnati, who's working on that here with me. That project is picking up some steam as we get going, though it was slowed down for sure by COVID.
I'm sure.
In this last year. And I think that, beyond that, a number of things that are really like extensions of earlier themes. So my co-author on this paper for Integrated HPS, Stefan Gudinger, the two of us are working on a follow-up paper where we develop some of the themes a little bit further than they are in that current form for the volume. I've got another paper with Stefan where we're looking at the theme of failure in the sciences, something that I've written a little bit on, and Stefan and I together actually. And we're looking specifically at some examples from protein biochemistry to try and understand how scientists deal with failure, think about failure, and especially in light of failure being more in the news because of reproducibility problems
Yeah.
in the sciences. And then I think that my next book project, which I hope to get to relatively soon, is one that develops work I've been doing on the intersection of genetics and physics and developmental biology. And so I've done a couple papers on that so far, and what I'd like to do is kind of develop it into a larger systematic treatment that analyzes what I think is a really interesting intersection of different sciences with different scientific styles coming together to try and understand a common phenomenon, and really cutting across some standard boundary lines that philosophers in particular have assumed, such as biology versus physics or something like that. And this work really breaks down those standard categories and is therefore really methodologically interesting to understand how they get work done, how they sometimes fail to get work done, and sort of better understanding the why behind both of those.
Oh, wow. All those projects sound like really, really exciting and awesome. You have so many things going. I guess this is more as a question about your process. Do you have a set writing process or a set process how you decide to work on things and when you decide to work on things? And additionally, since you have so many collaborators on your project, does that change your writing process or style at all?
Yeah, I think that from my perspective at least, it requires maybe a ability to switch gears pretty quickly, because you sometimes are moving in and out of very different contexts, especially if you're writing and the writing is for different audiences. And so you're changing expectations about, well, what can I assume the reader knows? And those sorts of questions. I think sometimes that's quite difficult to do, and I don't necessarily do it well. I think sometimes it slows me down, and it's probably normal that it would have that effect on people. However, at the same time, I feel like there's advantages to it, because I oftentimes find that I'm cross-pollinating by shifting back and forth between these projects. I think, oh, what I saw over there is actually relevant also over here. And because I had to switch back and forth relatively quickly between them, because we're working on the papers and we just had a meeting together and now we have a meeting together with these people, I actually can better apply those things in real time as I'm learning the lessons from that work. I think that the hardest part is sort of making sure that you give yourself small milestones for making progress so that you don't feel like something is stalling. So oftentimes I will tell myself, okay, despite the fact that my email box is jam-packed with things that are supposedly urgent, I want to come out of the day having done some writing, even if it's only for half an hour, 45 minutes. And even if it's the case that I end up having to heavily revise that writing, at least I've undertaken that this day. At the same time, there are days where it's not that the writing needs to be done, it's actually the reading, where I will sometimes say, you know what, I'm really distracted by all this stuff, but what I really need to do is read these 2 papers. And I need to like step away from the computer or turn off my email and do that. So I think that if you're making this kind of quick movement between different projects, it can have advantages, but it can have disadvantages. And yet also all of us are kind of overly busy with regular tasks that sometimes seem like they're more urgent or they have to be dealt with immediately. And I think then what you have to do is not despair, but rather give yourself a few strategies for making bite-sized progress on the principle that you eat the elephant one bite at a time. And so then the question is not, did you eat the elephant, but did you have a bite today?
That's very good advice. That's a good way to put things in perspective with work, especially if you do so many different things. I can't imagine trying to teach and then, having so many different kind of projects going. Yeah.
Well, now one thing to keep in mind though is that it grew organically over time. So if you dialed back to earlier in my career, I was not trying to do that many things. In part, I was working out of my dissertation, and which is the very normal thing to do as you're starting out. You've got a much tighter focus. And I think that the question then is one of how much do you open that up over time? And it's much easier to open that up when you are at certain career stages. So maybe if you already have tenure, you feel more comfortable trying some things that might not work. That's harder to do when you're an assistant professor and you feel like I need to get this paper out in order to build up my tenure dossier. So I would say that some of what you see now is something that you would not expect to see earlier in career trajectory, and that in fact you might argue that if you did see it earlier in somebody's career trajectory, you might warn them and say, be careful, because this could get you into trouble. I mean, a classic example of this in philosophy is single authorship. So most philosophy departments still take single authorship as a kind of gold standard for work that's done. Mm-hmm. And I remember one time talking to somebody about a paper that I had done in the sciences, and was the first author of 4 authors and had done the bulk of the work in the lab and had done the bulk of the writing of the paper. And somebody said, "Oh, so you're one of 4 authors, so you contributed 25%.
Oh no!
and you sort of realize, oh wow, this is, many people don't have a good way of understanding division of labor in some of these scientific contexts, because clearly you don't divide simply by the number of authors on the paper. But if that's what's perceived, then you have to be really careful, because if you are the assistant professor, the non-tenured faculty member, you're not in a position to argue as easily why the multi-authored paper is more your own in lots of ways than maybe some of the other authors. And so I think that as a general counsel, it's still important for younger philosophers and historians, I think, to make sure that they have some clear single author contributions so that those sorts of questions can be, negated. And that when you get past some of those initial hurdles, you can adopt the workflow that you enjoy and are most productive in. And for some people, that will continue to be mostly individual. Mm-hmm. So it's not that you can't continue productively in that vein. Many people do. But I think that for some of us, and I take myself to be in this category, we really enjoy the collaborative dimension of scholarship. And now I'm in a position where I can pursue that much more so according to my own interests, and not feel like maybe there will be a shadow hanging over that effort because somebody else might not understand it.
Yeah, that seems like a really great place to be career-wise, though, to have that freedom to kind of work how you want to work to some degree. Obviously,
ideally, you could. I mean, I think that would be what we would hope for when you're in a position where you have that kind of structure due to tenure or something like that. It would give you some of that freedom. I do think that an important lesson, though, and this is maybe hard for philosophy as a discipline to sometimes hear, is we need to be careful about expecting everybody to work in the same way. I think that scholars work differently. Some work more individually, some work more collaboratively, some work within disciplinary boundaries, some work across disciplinary boundaries. And it's not that one or the other of these is the better or the only way, but most of the time, there's a kind of standard expectation about what your work will look like that comes from other people who think, well, my work looks like that, so should yours. And so to me, the key thing is sort of making sure that your colleagues, whoever they are, whatever place you land, whatever community, intellectual community you find yourself in, that there's a kind of clear articulation of those preferences so that there isn't any kind of misunderstanding about, well, why are you doing what you're doing? And why did you adopt that strategy or that methodology, that collaboration, rather than working individually or only publishing in these journals and not those journals or something like that? I think it's that transparency of methodology that's really important, but we oftentimes don't have ways to convey that. It's not always, it's not the equivalent, I guess, of water cooler conversation in the philosophy department. Doesn't typically revolve around these sorts of things, in part because it requires acknowledging diversity, acknowledging that we're not all cut from the same cloth, and that actually is a good thing. And I think it's actually, in the history of philosophy, one of the most important things about philosophical inquiry, that there are many ways to do it, and that it's a good thing that people don't all take the same strategy in undertaking their analyses, whatever the subject matter they're interested in.
Yeah, I agree. That's really great. I think it's a lot of times, it's hard to kind of put that into perspective too, that everybody kind of works differently. Yeah, thank you. That was all like really great advice. I really appreciate it, and I appreciate your answers. I want to be cognizant of your time. We're like 5 minutes over, so if you have to go.
I can take one more question if you've got one.
Just have like a quick, this is just like a more general question. You've given really, really good advice and had awesome answers. I've really enjoyed talking to you. So I guess what I was wondering, just, if you have any general pieces of advice for anybody watching who's like new to philosophy or might be interested in getting into philosophy, or just like younger in their career starting grad school, if you had like one big piece of advice you would want to give anybody, what would that be?
So I would say that at an early stage of grad school, read widely. Very quickly, you will be channeled into a dissertation project that will force you deep. And so at that early stage, one of the best things you can do is go wide, because what you will find is that you're constrained quite tightly when you're writing the dissertation to stay focused. And so at an early stage, if possible, read widely, read outside of particular areas that you think you're interested in. Maybe take a seminar that's a stretch beyond what you would normally do. I sort of remember my first year of grad school, I took a seminar on philosophy of quantum mechanics. I don't do quantum mechanics. I don't sort of have any aspirations in that direction, right? But it was the right time to do it, because I certainly was not going to be reading and thinking about quantum mechanics when I was writing my dissertation on evolution and development. So I think that's an important piece. I think that the second piece of advice that I would offer is network, network. And that comes in a variety of different ways, but probably most naturally from simply being present at conferences and places where work is presented. So I'm a big fan of people going to conferences at an early stage of their career, even if they're not necessarily presenting a paper. Now, I know that that can present financial difficulties. Some departments don't support that. But the idea is you really learn something distinctive by getting into the environment and rubbing sort of elbows with people in that setting that's just completely different than you get in a home department graduate program setting, where people do most of their growing and developing as scholars. So I would say, if you can, that networking in person. Obviously, there's lots of ways that networking can happen online now. There's some additional strategies that make that possible. But I would say, once vaccines become widely available and implemented for COVID, and conferences start opening up again, that's a great place for the aspiring graduate student to locate themselves, both to stimulate their own thinking about the topics that are of interest to them, but also simply to recognize that you're in a community of other people doing like-minded projects, and you have lots of things to learn from them because they're not the same as you. And that can be really crucial sometimes, because graduate programs of particular departments can have a flavor to them. And you come out of your graduate department and you go, wow, they do things really differently over there. Yeah. and I think you shouldn't have that experience after you finish your PhD and get a job. You should have that experience much earlier, because it's actually quite beneficial to you in your own intellectual development to be able to recognize those differences. Not because it's going to change you. You might actually say, all right, that's different, but I don't want to work that way. I like the way I work. That's fine, but you're aware that there's a different way to work. So I guess, in sum, both of my recommendations have to do with kind of keeping yourself open to recognizing that there's a wider space of ideas and topics than just what will be in your dissertation. And there's a lot to be learned from engaging with other scholars, and especially those who might not operate according to the way that you are most familiar from your own graduate program.
Thank you for that. That was really great advice. I really appreciate it. I'm sure anybody who's watching who's in similar situation will also really appreciate it. Yeah, so that's kind of all the questions I have. Thank you for staying a few minutes longer.
Oh, no, thank you, Colleen. This has been really fun.
Yeah, I really, really enjoyed this. I really appreciate you taking the time to meet with me. And your research is really interesting. I really, really like it. I'm going to have to read more of it. Yeah, this was really awesome. Thank you so much.
Great. Okay, well, so hopefully in the next year or so, I will see you at a conference. And I look forward to the opportunity to talk then.
Yes, that'd be great.
Okay.
Have a good semester.
Yeah, you too. Bye-bye.
Thank you so much.